Hello and welcome to my channel. Today we will discuss the articulations between bones. So let's begin. The articulation between bones called arthrology. It's the study of joints, and arthroses or joint formation is subdivided into synarthrosis and diarthroses. Synarthrosis means solid joints or joints with no or very little movement between the articulating bones, and they are composed of bones that articulate together by a special type of connective tissue which is solid, and they are subdivided into fibrous and cartilaginous joints, and we will discuss this later. Diarthrosis means cavitated joints or freely mobile joints. They are bones bonded together by a sleeve of fibrous tissue capsule enclosing a cleft between the articular surfaces of bones with the covering hyaline cartilage on top of the articular surfaces. These are called the synovial joints, or the bones that the joint that resembles an ova, an egg, it has a shell and a lining membrane and inside egg yolk. Now, to discuss the synarthroses are subdivided into fibrous joints and cartilaginous joints. The fibrous joints themselves are subdivided into suture, syndesmosis, gumphoses. It's based on the type and shape of the bounding tissue between the bones. For example, the suture bones, they are composed of bone attached to another bone by a sutural ligament. Example for which are the skull sutures, like the sagittal suture and the coronal suture, etc. Syndesmosis, there are bones that's bound together by an interosseous membrane or membrane between the bones, and actually the main purpose of the membrane is to provide surface for the attachment of the acting muscles. So it's bone, interosseous fibrous tissue, and bone. Examples are the interosseous membranes between the radius and ulna, interosseous membrane between the tibia and fibula. Gumphoses, the bones are bound together by a special type of membrane. It's called the periodontium, and it's present only in teeth. It's the joint that forms the articulation between the tooth and its alveolar socket, either in the maxilla or in the mandible. It's of the pagan socket type, and it's composed of bone, periodontium, then the dental cement. Cartilaginous joints subdivided into synchondroses and symphyses. Synchondroses are composed of bones bound together by a piece of hyaline cartilage. It's of the primary cartilaginous types, means that it ossifies with age, and the example of which is the epiphyseal plates. All of us know that all the epiphyseal plates disappear by the age of 25 when the joints are, when the bones are fully mature. Or the symphysis type, it's composed of bone, hyaline cartilage on top of the bone, then a piece of fibrocartilaginous disc between the two hyaline cartilages, hyaline cartilage again that belongs to the other bone, then the other bone. So it's bone, hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, hyaline cartilage, and bone. They are of the secondary cartilaginous type, and the examples are the manubriosternal junction, the intervertebral discs, and in previous lectures studying the intervertebral discs, you know that the disc is formed of circular fibers of fibrocartilage called the annulus fibrosus that enclose in the middle a soft pad of special gelatinous material called the nucleus pulposus, and this is the one that herniates in disc prolapse, for example. Example of symphysis are the pubis and the symphysis menti. This is a drawing of the gomphoses type. This is the tooth, and the periodontal membrane here is highlighted in orange, and the cement and or the alveolar socket that belongs to the mandible in this case. This is the fibrous joint of the syndesmosis type, which is the interosseous membrane. The interosseous membrane here, example here is the one that unites or bonds the radius with the ulna. Another type of joints, fibrous joints, is the suture joint. Here you can see the coronal suture, the temporal suture, the lambdoid or occipital suture, and in the middle we have the sagittal suture. There are no movements, of course, between the bones of the skull. That's why they are called synarthroses. And all of us know now that this part of the skull is called the calvaria. The upper part of the skull is composed of membranous bones, as we studied earlier. These are bones that develop in membrane and cannot be replaced by bone tissue if fractured. That's why we need to insert a prosthesis in case of surgical interventions, for example, to operate on the brain. This is an example of a symphysis joint. This is the symphysis pubis. It's composed of bone. A piece of hyaline cartilage covers the bone, then a piece of fibrocartilaginous disc between the two hyaline cartilages, another piece of hyaline cartilage, and then the bone. This is an example of an epiphyseal plate, but here at the end of the tibia and here at the end of the fibula. All of us know now that the epiphyseal plate will come to complete closure, or there will be complete fusion of bone by the age of 25. Diarthroses means the cavitated joints or joints with free range of movement. There must be certain conditions to be fulfilled for a joint to be classified as synovial joint. It must have a capsule, fibrous capsule. The capsule is lined by a synovial membrane. It's formed by a special type of cells called the synoviocytes. The synoviocytes also secrete a fluid called the synovial fluid that fills the cavity of the synovial joint. And this fluid is rich in protein and hyaluronic acid, so it acts as a lubricant and nutrition for the joint itself. Also, the articular surfaces of the bone must be smooth and covered with hyaline cartilage. And at last, there are ligaments that belongs to the joint. And these ligaments, you can classify them as capsular and non-capsular. Capsular ligaments means they are thickenings in the capsule. I mean that they cannot be separated from the capsule unless you tear the capsule, of course. Non-capsular ligaments, it's separate ligaments, but these separate ligaments, according to their site, classified into intra-articular and extra-articular. And intra-articular means inside the joint cavity, but please do not confuse this with intrasynovial cavity. It's never intrasynovial, or it will be torn by the articulated surfaces. For example, the cruciate ligaments of the knee, they are intra-articular, means inside the cavity of the knee joint, but they are not inside the synovial cavity of the joint itself. That's why the membrane, synovial membrane, folds around them to separate them from the cavity. Extra-articular ligaments means ligaments outside the joints, like the medial and lateral ligaments of the knee joint, of the wrist joint, of the elbow joint, etc. Now, there's a classification for synovial joints according to their shape. shape of the articular surfaces, of course. Plain synovial joints means opposition of articular surfaces, flat articular surfaces. The example is the intermetatarsal and intermetacarpal joints, between the metatarsal bones and the metacarpal bones. Ligaments or hinge joints, they are uniaxial. They act like a hinge. Uniaxial means not the movement, but the axis of the joint. It has only one axis. In the case of the elbow, for example, it has a transverse axis around which the elbow flexes and extends. So there are two movements around one axis. Okay? Examples are the elbow joints and the interphalangeal joints, the joints between the phalanges. Trochoid or pivot type, in which the bone rotates around a longitudinal axis, like it has only one axis, uniaxial, and the joint, I said, rotates or pivots around this axis, and usually it's an osteoligamentous ring, like the superior radioulnar joint and the joint between the atlas and axis, the atlantoaxial joint. Condylar type, they are uniaxial. Uniaxial, but there are a little range of different movements in these type of joints, with which is rotation. Example is the knee joint with the gliding movement, like in the temporomandibular joint, for example, as another example. Ellipsoid means the articular surfaces are shaped like an ellipse, and it's biaxial means there are four movements, usually flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction. Oval convex surface, elliptical opposing surfaces like radiocarpal joint, which is the wrist joint, and the metacarpophalangeal joints, the joint between the metacarpal and the phalanges. Sellar or saddle joint, they are biaxial. The opposing surfaces are concavo-convex surfaces, like the atlanto-occipital joint. Sometimes the atlanto-occipital joint is classified as flat joint, but also the first carpo-metacarpal joint. You all know the free range of movement of the thumb. It's because of the saddle type of the first carpo-metacarpal joint and the ankle joint. Sphenoidal or ball and socket, it's multi-axial, means free range of movement, like the hip and the shoulder joints. Movements as described: flexion opposite the extension, adduction opposite adduction, dorsiflexion and plantar flexion that occurs at the ankle joint, rotation, and the sum of all these movements is called the circumduction. This is a picture showing an example of a hinge joint, which is the humeroulnar or the elbow joint between the distal end of the humerus and the notch of the ulna, as you can see here. Also to show you the superior radioulnar joint, which is between the head of the radius and the annular ligament that surround the head of the radius. This is a type of pivot joint. Now, the intercarpal and or intermetacarpal joints here are flat joints. Okay. Metacarpophalangeal joints are the synovial joints that show ellipsoid type means flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, while the interphalangeal joints are only hinge joints with only one range of movement, which is flexion and extension. And this is a diagram of how the synovial joint is composed or articulated. These are the two articular surfaces covered by a piece of hyaline cartilage. And in the case of knee, there will be an extra piece of cartilage, of fibrocartilage, which is the meniscus. They are all lined in the synovial cavity, the cavity within the joint. This is the synovial membrane in orange, containing the synovial fluid and the articular cartilages. And then from the outside, there is the fibrous capsule that encloses the whole joint. Okay, these are the intercarpal joints, which are flat joints. And this is the first carpo-metacarpal joint, which is a saddle joint, allowing for rather free movement of the thumb. This is the first carpo-metacarpal joint. This is the temporomandibular joint between the head of the mandible and the mandibular fossa on the base of the skull. And this is the superior radioulnar joint between the head of the radius and the annular ligament that surrounds the head of the radius. You can notice here that the synovial membrane of the elbow joint and the superior radioulnar joint is continuous. See? Okay, this is an example of a ball and socket joint, which is the hip joint. This is the head of the femur articulating with the acetabulum or acetabular cavity of the hip bone. This is an example of a ball and socket. This is another example of a ball and socket, which is between the head of the humerus and the glenoid fossa of the scapula. But please note here that the relation between the surface area of the head of the humerus, head of the femur, and the surrounding or the articular surfaces that encloses them. In this case is the acetabulum, in this case is the glenoid. You can see here that the head of the humerus is much bigger than the glenoid cavity, so that's why we have more range of movement in the shoulder rather than in the hip joint. The hip joint, the acetabulum, almost encloses most of the head of the femur, but on the expense of the stability, of course. The hip joint is more stable than the shoulder joint, which frequently dislocates, and we studied this in the upper limb. Okay, you can classify joints of the body, a human body, anatomically into joints of the hand, joints, the elbow joint, the wrist joint, the axillary joint, which is the shoulder joint, sternoclavicular joint, the vertebral articulations, the intervertebral joints, I mean, the temporomandibular joints, the sacroiliac joints, the joint between the sacrum and the iliac part of the hip bone, the hip joints between the femur and the acetabulum, the knee joints between the distal end of the femur and proximal end of the tibia. Note that the fibula is not enclosed in the knee joint. It's not an articular surface. And the articulation between the bones of the foot. The clinical significance of joint, damaging of the articular cartilage inside the joints or the bone themselves, articular surfaces, may produce limitation of movement and pain. And the muscles that stabilize the joints can lead to dislocations and osteoarthritis. The excellent exercise to preserve the joints is swimming. Any disorder in a joint is called arthropathy. When involving an inflammation of one or more joints, the disorder is called arthritis. Arthropathies may be monoarticular or polyarticular. Polyarticular involves more than one joint. Monoarticular means involving only a single joint. And polyarticular usually because of a generalized disease, but monoarticular may be a trauma to the joint itself. Arthritis is the leading cause of disability in elderly, in the people are above 55. It takes different forms. Each has a different cause. The most common form of arthritis is osteoarthritis. It's also known as degenerative joint disease, and it occurs following a trauma or to the joint, or infection of the joint, or simply as a result of wear and tear because of aging and deterioration of the articular cartilage inside the joint. Other forms of arthritis, which is autoimmune in this example, is rheumatoid arthritis and psoriatic arthritis. There is also septic arthritis and gouty arthritis, which is gout. It's caused by the deposition of uric acid crystals in the joint, results in the inflammation of the joint itself. Also, there is a temporomandibular joint syndrome in which there's the jaw joint causes pain when moving and clicking sounds in the jaw, or limitation of jaw movements. It's caused by psychological tension and misalignment of the jaw. It's called malocclusion. There are, of course, many diseases that affects the joints of the body. Well, I hope you got the maximum benefit from this lecture, and thank you very much for watching.